It's an election victory that's been called a landslide as U.S. President-elect Donald Trump is set to return to the White House. What will this mean for U.S. policy when it comes to the Middle East? Now, much has changed since Trump's been gone, but the situation in Syria remains the same. And how's Ankara viewing Trump's comeback? I'll break that all down and more here on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. If you asked me how the last 4 years have been between Ankara and Washington, I'd say it's been tumultuous. A relationship that was once centered on personal diplomacy became institutionalized under Biden. Now, a new administration is coming to the White House, but with a familiar face at the helm. Donald Trump's decisive victory brings with it many questions about what U.S. policy will look like. His election win will be felt far beyond the U.S., especially in Ukraine, where the future president claims he can end the war in one day. Trump, who proclaimed himself as Israel's best friend, is inheriting a powder keg in Gaza and Lebanon. One issue that's remained unchanged since he left office 4 years ago is Syria, where Trump wanted to withdraw U.S. troops. With the region in chaos, he'll be looking to U.S. allies for support. One of them will surely be Turkish President Erdogan. Both leaders share a close personal relationship, but they've also bumped heads on foreign policy. So will issues like Ukraine, where Trump and Erdogan see eye to eye, help advance ties? Or will differences in the war on Gaza place both leaders in opposite camps? For more on what a second Trump presidency could mean for Turkey and the Middle East, joining me now from McLean, Virginia is Herbert Regenbogen. He's a professor at Istanbul Kent University. From Washington, D.C., Rich Utzin. He's a foreign policy analyst. And from Ankara, Ragıp Soylu. He's the Turkey bureau chief at the Middle East Eye. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. A thrilling election, but a lot of uncertainty going forward. And I want to break it all down with you. Now, I want to start chronologically with probably what's the most urgent. And I think that's the war in Ukraine. President Trump has said, I'm going to get it done in one day. Now, obviously, that's not realistic. But Herbert, how can President Trump bring peace to Ukraine?
By making a deal. That's his motto. And in some option would be to give the territorial integrity back to Ukraine. But that's probably off the table since 2022 when it once was offered. Now it's probably going to be a model of permanent neutrality if the Ukrainian government accepts that. So no NATO troops on Ukrainian soil and no Russians on Ukrainian soil. But the question is, will the annexed countries of eastern Ukraine be accepted? That's the big part of this so-called deal.
Rich, making a deal, Herbert says, is it going to be that easy? Is it going to be one day, or is this going to be months and months of negotiating?
Right. Well, sort of like when talking about biblical prophecy, interpreting 1 day or 7 days as the amount of time it takes for the Lord's work is problematic. So I think in this case, the general approach will be a businessman's approach. I think President-elect Trump has made clear that he wants to see the bloodshed come to an end. Look, the lines are not moving that much. I don't have any particular inside knowledge on this, but studying sort of what the art of the possible is on the battlefield and where I think Trump generally operates in this space, I would anticipate something like the following, that he'll go to Ukraine first and apparently has already had a very positive call with President Zelensky. I think he'll reassure Zelensky and say, look, I need you to work with me. You need to be willing to negotiate. You're not going to get all your war aims, and you're probably not going to get all the territory back, at least not at this stage. But work with me on my plan, and I will not abandon you, and you will not lose more. Then I think he'll go to Putin and say, look, you're not going to get everything you want. Your war aims of so-called denazification and ending Ukrainian sovereignty are not going to happen. And if you don't work with me, I'm going to triple my aid and assistance to Ukraine and triple your losses. And I think that creates an opening. I think what that looks like. Does it look like a demilitarized area with a plebiscite in 5 years or something like that? Does it look like international observers? I agree. Putin cannot accept presence of NATO troops or NATO membership. I'm interested in the fact that the Turks have been in Ukraine previously as part of the OSCE observer mission in Ukraine. I think there might be a role in that Ukraine and Russia would both accept for countries like Turkey that have good relations with both Moscow and Kyiv. But I think that'll be the opening salvos in the negotiation. And frankly, I don't see Putin coming to a conclusion until his battlefield losses increase. So while this negotiation goes on, I think there's going to have to be continued Western support, military support to Kyiv.
Raga, back in April 2022, there was a deal brokered in Istanbul, a deal that it looked like the Russians and the Ukrainians agreed upon before a certain British politician, according to what the Russian president said, ended up sabotaging that deal. Do you think that April 2022 deal could be some type of a foundation for Trump to work off of?
I mean, definitely there's a willingness by Turkey to host such talks. Today, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan clearly expressed willingness to play a mediation role between Russia and Ukraine, and said that he can also work with the Trump administration to make that happen. But I think we are a long way away from 2022 Istanbul summit, because the amount of territory occupied by Russia is much larger than 2022. And also, I think the willingness from the Ukrainian side to basically let go of these areas is really small. But in the same time, if you look at the Ukraine war, you see that Ukraine is losing more territories on the ground. And there's a problem and a shortage of manpower within the military, as well as always this constant complaining about the lack of weapons and ammunition. So I think it's really hard to know what will eventually happen. But when we talk about the Istanbul talks, I would always want to underline the fact that as two sides were about to sign this deal, apart from the Boris Johnson's influence, there was also reports of Bucha massacre, which basically, upended the public psychology in Ukraine. The public backlash was too strong for Ukraine to sign such a deal at the time. But of course, retrospectively speaking, it was a missed moment. It would have been much better for Ukrainian people and Russians to basically sign a deal at the time.
Herbert, Robert Kennedy Jr., an important part of the Trump campaign, in a conversation with a prominent U.S. journalist, he talked about Donald Trump drawing a map of Syria, a map of the Middle East on a napkin, but specifically concentrating on the Syria-Turkey border, saying that U.S. troops need to get out of that region. Do you foresee Trump completing the partial Syria withdrawal from his first administration and his second administration?
Yes. The reason is because the entire Middle East is in a total fluxation, and the non-state actors are going to have to leave the role they have played as proxies for the state. In this concept, the countries of the Middle East will have to take self-responsibility for governance. And while Syria lives from the sale of narcotics and not from some kind of other exports, it's necessary that the states, and this is, I think, what President Trump is going to be pushing, is that states take their responsibilities very seriously. And that includes national security. Because if they don't, that's going to make the United States vulnerable. And as America leaves the international stage and turns more isolationist, the more economic tools will be to coerce states in taking their role in the international rule-based order.
Rich, you're a man that knows Syria very well. You also know Turkey very well. The Syrian border for Turkey, a national security concern as well. Is there any room for any type of coordination or cooperation with the Americans if Trump decides to complete the withdrawal?
Well, I think so. I think there has to be, frankly. There's no way to do any change to the status quo in northeast Syria responsibly without a high degree of coordination between the U.S. and Turkey. So I think we have to keep in mind here that the foreign policy team hasn't really been set yet for the Trump administration. That's going to take a couple of weeks, couple of months, really. Who's going to be the Secretary of State? Who are going to be the key officers below him? There's going to be national security advisor. All of these things are going to have to be reviewed and discussed. I think Trump's instinct, though, is to look at what's been done and to say, look, we did what we needed to do in terms of crushing the ISIS caliphate. And now there's a decreasing return on investment for the troops that we have there. They're targets for Iranian militias, Iran-backed militias, that is. And frankly, they're in between our NATO ally and a very messy situation. So I think his instinct, his impulse is going to be to say, let's find a way to make this more sustainable. And that might mean withdrawal. It might mean a new arrangement. I think that implies a far greater degree of direct coordination between Turkish and American officials than we've seen over the last year or two. YPG on the border, for instance, maybe there's a phased thing where the YPG is no longer along the border as the element of the SDF there, maybe Christian forces or Arab forces. Maybe there's a new round of talks between the Turkish-backed forces in the north and the folks that the U.S. have been supporting and working through. Bottom line is there still is an ISIS problem, and we need to address that, but we also need to address it in a way that's sustainable in terms of our alliance with Turkey. So we'll see energy on this issue, and who's in the administration, who's driving that conversation will in turn influence the modalities of what kind of an arrangement we can come to. I do think there's room for coordination.
Ragib, back when Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan got reelected, President Trump tweeted congratulations, referring to him as a good friend. Erdogan, one of the first to tweet congratulations to President-elect Donald Trump as well, referring to him as a good friend. Now, as a journalist, you've spent many years in D.C. covering the Trump administration. You spent many years in Ankara covering the Erdogan administration. So you have a very close view of both administrations. How is that personal friendship, and what are you expecting in bilateral relations with the return of Trump?
I think Erdogan has set the tone with an interview that he has given today, basically saying that there will be a phone diplomacy. I mean, if you remember former National Security Advisor John McMaster's book that came out over the summer, he basically complained about the fact that Erdogan got the personal phone number of Trump, and he was completely, and constantly bugging Trump all the time about the policy priorities that he has. And he was constantly talking to Trump to basically convince him on certain issues, including Syria. I think that will be the main dynamic in this relationship, that we would see this leader-to-leader approach rather than institutional approach. I mean, I was talking to this senior Turkish official who said that, they think during the second Trump term, the institutions will be better, basically playing a better role in the sense that Trump loyalists will be effectively taking those Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor positions. So they will be better representing Trump in those conversations with the Turkish officials. And as well as you will have the better relationship with the leaders. So there will be a big room for further cooperation. I mean, there hasn't been any celebration or festivities in Ankara after the news that, Trump was elected. But people were, basically believing that this is a positive news for the Turkish-American relationship because both leaders know each other really well. And they also played this election campaign period really well. I mean, they didn't really make certain, attempts to contact the both campaigns. They basically took to behind the scenes approach. And I mean, there was only one approach by Erdogan, a phone call to Trump, especially after the assassination attempt to the former president or the president-elect. So I think they played it really well so far, and people are really hopeful in Ankara.
Herbert, Ragib seems optimistic on Trump's return. What are your thoughts? Is a Trump presidency going to open up a new page in relations between Turkey and the United States? And can that personal relationship translate into a more aligned foreign policy for the two NATO allies?
Yes. This is the watershed. This is the new world of governance. The issue here is the rule of a rule-based governance, not one that's only based on the power of one country, but rather the acceptance and the principles that all countries have accepted as the rule of law. And consequently, when you have leaders who take the initiative to do work one-on-one, which is President Trump's calling card, he's going to set a new understanding of how to do business because he's making the deal. And he can because he has the power and unrestricted power. And consequently, he's going to use it to make America great again. Whatever that might mean to some, it means that America is going to play the role, what it has been given in terms of what it expects, that the world is living in peace. And security is a very important part of that. And while America is trying to dissolve itself of its major role as it has in the past 80 years, it's not losing sight that it needs strong partners to be sure that there is security in the world. And so we're talking about cooperation. And that cooperation means trust. It does not mean an idea that you're going to make everybody happy, but you're going to respect everybody as they are. And that means the leaders. And you may not be in agreement with any of these leaders, but that is what political and geopolitical and diplomacy is about, is the paradox. And I think President Trump is going to set a new governance, a new watershed in this kind of 80 years plus understanding about the rule of law and security.
Rich, over the past 4 years, Biden has institutionalized the relationship. Now, Erdogan's not used to that. He likes leadership diplomacy, but there really haven't been a proper bilateral between Erdogan and Biden, except for on the sidelines of these multilateral platforms, whether it be NATO, the UN, other meetings when the G20, when they end up meeting up. Now, during this time, Turkey has definitely gotten closer to Russia, more meetings with China as well, a partner country in the BRICS. Could Trump bring Erdogan closer to the United States?
It's an excellent question. And first, I want to give a little bit of praise to the team below Biden for how they've managed the relationship. It was, as you know, after the inauguration in the first 6 months or so of the Biden administration, very distant, not a lot of contacts. That changed a little bit after February 2022 with Russia's ramped up war of aggression against Ukraine, when the Biden administration realized it really needed Turkey's help to try to push for peace and to support Ukraine. What we saw after that was that we had a very good ambassador, Jeff Flake, in Ankara, and we had a high level of engagement from the State Department and the Department of Defense. We saw more bilateral military exercises between Turkey and the United States, some defense cooperation, consultations within something called the strategic mechanism. So I do want to push back gently by saying I think that sort of institutionalized contact was actually done reasonably well. But as you've pointed out, when that does not find its counterpart at the most senior level, when the two top officials are not talking and there's not a clear common policy line or a set of initiatives, that can only go so far. So I think the fact that these two know each other, that they have sort of a complementary worldview, one in which you talk to everybody, even the quote bad guys, as opposed to the sort of this idea that you can't talk to Putin, you can't talk to Xi, you can't talk to the bad people. I think Trump and Erdogan both have in mind that, look, you have to talk to the bad people and sometimes make deals with them. And that also means that you have to have some agility. And I think both men, both Trump and Erdogan, have a history of seeking, and sometimes they'll change quite abruptly on a foreign policy line that their country's been following in order to strike a deal.
Raghib, when Trump last left office, there was a wave of normalization, recognition, reconciliation. Now he's coming back in about a couple months. Gaza's on fire, Lebanon's on fire. Tensions between Israel and Iran could immediately flare up. The expectation of the Turkish president is that Trump is going to be able to solve this. And he tweeted twice. One of them was that he made a promise. And that Erdogan expected to be fulfilled. He also said that a good start would be for Mr. Trump to cut off arms support to Israel in order to stop Israeli aggression in Palestine and Lebanon. What type of expectations does Erdogan have, and what are Trump's limits or his willingness to get this done?
I think this is a very complex question in the sense that, of course, Trump, I think, is willing to basically declare end of secession, or cessation of hostilities basically is on his agenda, right? Like, I think he would seek for a ceasefire. He would probably, end the conflict right away, beginning his term. But in the same time, like, it's a complex question in the sense that you can basically end the conflict by just declaring a ceasefire, and then what happens to Gaza? Like, do you hold the northern Gaza? Do you allow Israel to basically annex certain parts of Gaza, or what do you do about the post-war reconstruction, about the return of the refugees? I mean, I'm talking about the people within Gaza, or how do you resolve the conflict in Lebanon? I mean, are you going to allow the permanent Israeli presence in the southern Lebanon, or are you going to basically cut another deal that would basically indirectly involve Lebanon as well? I think these are the parts that people have no answer for. I think when President Trump talks about end of the forever wars, or when he talks about that he will bring the peace to the Middle East, I think he's speaking on his mind and also his heart as well, because it was his main platform since 2016 that he doesn't want forever wars anymore. But at the same time, these nuances might basically can go against the Turkish point of view, because Erdogan is basically pursuing Israel as an occupier power, and he thinks that Israel is basically conducting a genocide in Gaza, which I'm very sure Trump doesn't share with. So, and also the other part is that the Iran. I mean, you've seen the reports that Brian Hook is like basically anti-Iran hawk, basically assigned as a head of the transition team at the State Department. So maximum pressure against Iran would return to the table, and which Erdogan also doesn't support, because a maximum pressure against Iran maybe could be in favor of Turkish interests in the region, but in the same time, it might result in more exodus from Iran to Turkish borders, more immigration. It might also torpedo to the bilateral trade.
Mm-hmm. Herbert, Trump says, I'm Israel's best friend, but at the same time, he also touts no wars during his time in office. Now, it doesn't look like this time both of them can go hand in hand, or are they mutually exclusive? What's going to happen? How is he going to get out of what's happening in Gaza and possibly spreading to Lebanon?
Well, as I said beforehand, it's about state actors taking responsibilities and proxies ceasing. And in conjunction with war, and not that continues, President-elect Trump, with all probability, is going to say, and is saying, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have so much time until January 21st to do what you need to do to end this war. And then, if you don't, we're coming in with a whole new scenario, which may not be the one that you even want. Because remember, his election, and he won it, was because of a Muslim vote, a vote that's very significant. And the reason that that group of Americans didn't support the Democrats was because of the way the policy by President Biden was being handled. The people of Gaza are victims, at least in the sense that the American in domestic policy understands, or the Republicans understand, this is something that needs to be treated very seriously. At the same time, the Jewish community has a very strong lobby, and traditionally, this is going to continue. The question is it going to continue to where the annexation of the West Bank, as one of the cabinet members have said in the Knesset, will occur? These are the challenges, and I think President-elect Trump doesn't want to get into such muddy waters. He wants a very clear, delineated, strategic plan to end and to begin an era where he is really making the deal. And this includes Iran.
Rich, Raghib, and Herbert both mentioned Iran. Is maximum pressure Iran policy coming back?
I think that the personnel that are going to be, again, personnel is policy, so that's going to be determinative. But essentially, the Trump movement has a theory, the president as well as most of his foreign policy advisors, about the region, about the Middle East, that's very different from that of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, sort of following on the Obama approach, was we have to get along with Iran in this region, and that ultimately we need to address some of their concerns and maybe a gradual nuclearization within certain limits, and let them co-manage the region. The Trump team's view, which I subscribe to as well, is that you should take Iran at its word when it says death to Israel and death to the United States. And that actually this long-running war by proxy against Israel and the United States interests, by the way, which they've also pursued against Turkish interests, is something that needs to be combated through strong deterrence.
I want to give the last question to Raghav. Raghav, you have 1 minute. Abraham Accords, are they returning or are they shelved for now?
I think they will eventually return, even though it might take a few years for Saudi Arabia to come back to the table, but they will definitely come back, and we will see more countries normalizing with Israel, not immediately, but in few years, yes.
Raghav, Rich, Herbert, thank you for joining me. That was a fantastic conversation. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.